All right, I am recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me. This video is going to be about modernism and postmodernism. We are continuing our study of this book, Beginning Theory, by Peter Berry. This is chapter 4 of Peter Berry's book. It's one of the most important chapters of the book and one of the best written chapters. It is titled Postmodernism. But we read in this chapter about two related movements identified with these terms, modernism and postmodernism. It's also debatable whether or not, to what extent, there is a clear boundary separating these two. Some people believe that they are continuous, they're not that different, they're not fundamentally different from each other. But if you read about these two, we read about several interpretations of them, several reactions to them, and we read about what it means to be a postmodern critic, postmodern literary or cultural critic, the task of such a critic, the aims of such a critic, which essentially, the aims, the task of such a critic essentially have to do with doing criticism, paying attention to works of art, paying attention to cultural moments, cultural artifacts, doing those things with an eye on all the things that we read in this chapter, we read about. So informed by the postmodernist themes, postmodernist topics, temperaments, sensibilities, the critic becomes a postmodernist critic. So paying attention, having these in mind, a critic performs the tasks of a postmodernist critic. My approach in this presentation is I want to first talk about the similarities between modernism and postmodernism, and then I will talk about the differences between the two, instead of starting with a definition of this and a definition of that, which is incredibly difficult to do. And then if I do that, then I have to just keep correcting that definition, getting into more and more minutia detail, saying, well, that's not entirely correct, and this is why. So instead of that, I'm going to give an overall impression of these two movements. So let's start with similarities. The similarities between modernism and postmodernism. First, there's a tendency in both of these to highlight small-scale elements of a work of art instead of the overarching totality, the elements. We pay attention to the elements of the work of art, elements of painting, elements of literature, elements of language, as opposed to the, as I said, overarching total picture. The total picture is not in focus. There might not be a total picture. Even if there is, it might not be in focus. If it is in focus, it is as much in focus as the elements that construct it. So The Wasteland is by Eliot. It's a textbook example. By textbook example, I mean it's an example that every discussion, almost every discussion, brings it as an example. A more recent example is that book I reviewed, published in North America this year, last year in Australia, Grimish. In that book, we pay as much attention to the elements of the story. For example, one of the elements is journalistic articles about Joe Grimm, the boxer, Joe Grimm. Autobiographical vignettes, or biographical episodes, sometimes imaginary autobiographical. Biographical episodes, as I said, an article, an essay, a journalist wrote about Joe Grimm, a boxing match, and those are, the elements are, and their contrast, the contrast in their style. Each chapter is written in a different style. And for that reason, the elements that construct the whole book become prominent. You feel like you're reading a collection of pieces. But at the same time, it's one story. It is one book. It is about Joe Grimm, the boxer, the paint artist. Okay, so that was number one. Attention to elements. Because of their, so the second one, moving on to the second one, this is related. Because of their concern with form and technique. Form, technique, these are elements of a work. They become almost inevitably both modernism and postmodernism, both modernist and postmodernist critics and creators, artists, they become ironic because they are aware of the process. They want to become aware of the elements and want to cultivate that awareness. And because of that, they create a distance between themselves and the form, the technique, the elements. So that's the irony is the second feature in common in modernism and postmodernism. The irony becomes stronger in postmodernism. There's still more sincerity in modernism. We will get to that later. They are third. Was that the third or fourth? Third. Both of these movements are now the type of thing that they do, their way of engagement. They are experimental. They want to find out what happens as a result of a certain technique. If I use this technique in combination with this other technique, or if I use this technique in this for this purpose, what will happen? And this is especially the case with modernism and modernist movements in art, like surrealism, Dadaism. Modernism is more committed to an attachment, or more committed or more attached to technique and form, rather than content or worldview or ideas. Classical artists in 19th century, up to 19th century, they tend to have worldviews. They tend to have a commitment to a way of viewing the world. Could be a religious worldview, or it could be an Enlightenment worldview, in the case of Enlightenment writers. The name escapes me, but I'm trying to remember the name of that French writer highly associated with Enlightenment, author of the book Jacques the Fatalist, Diderot, Denis Diderot. Oh, okay, so attachment to a worldview is before modernism. But a modernist artist is not committed to a worldview. She or he might be committed to something like stream of consciousness. That's not a worldview. That's a method. That's a process. It's a technique, or it's an element of form. Or they might be committed to highly elegant prose, a prose that is very minimalistic and elegant. Or a style of poetry that is attentive to sounds rather than words or phrases. You want to pay attention to the sounds that you're making, like the sound of S. Okay, next. Modernism and postmodernism are both confronting fragmentation, either as state of affairs, describing the fragmented state of society, the world, belief systems, or features of works of art, putting together patchwork, a work of art that is patchwork of other works. There's this Canadian writer, his name escapes me also, just like the similar Diderot. He's much less famous than Diderot. Something he does is that he goes to libraries and saves, quote unquote, saves these books that library wants to give away because nobody's borrowing them. And he takes these books and takes them apart and puts them together. Creates his own handmade books by putting together fragments from a collection of disposed of books. So that's considering that as a creation, as a work of art. You might refuse to consider that as a legitimate work work of art. But if you do assume that, it will be falling in modernism or postmodernism. Next, because of the fragmentation, both modernism and postmodernism create works that are relatively immune to deconstruction. So remember, deconstruction challenges the stability of what is at the center of a text and what is in the margins, what is being neglected, what is being pushed aside. Deconstruction wants to say, no, what is being pushed aside, alternative interpretations, things that are not super clear, that are not at the center of our attention. Those things are as important. But because of the fragmentation, the texts or paintings, works of arts, movies, they don't have that stable center anymore. So a modernist or postmodernist work of art, for that reason, is immune to deconstruction. It already has a deconstructive voice within it. And because already these works don't have a clear separation between figure and ground, between main subject, main theme, and secondary themes. As I was writing this, I thought about one short novel that I read recently by Dostoevsky. It is clearly ahead of its time. It was dismissed in its own time. And I think it does fit within the modernist or even postmodernist. No, modernist. It is ahead of its time by being modernist in its form. The Double. It is a modernist work because it is fragmented. It doesn't have a stable, clear narrative. We don't really know what is going on. Is this character really losing his mind? What is the double? Why is the double so much more confident than this main character? In any case, there is this division, an isolation of the perspective that is supposed to be our hero. And when Dostoevsky talks about our hero several times throughout the novel, regularly, frequently, refers to him as our hero did this, our hero did that. He's doing so ironically because he's so powerless. How can he be the hero? He's the center of our attention. He's the center of the story. But other than that, he is totally powerless. He's so much closer to the hero or character, not really hero, character in a Kafka novel. Another less discussed work by Dostoevsky is called The White Nights, or Bright Nights, depending on the translation. This is also, I think, a modernist work ahead of its time, ahead of that era, modernist era, which is officially from 1910 to 1930. That was the official movement. Anyways, The White Nights, the whole story is incidental. The whole story is like an accident. It's an accidental encounter between two characters. And what happens in the story, White Nights, it is a distraction from, a detour from the real story, the real, imagine a classic story, a classic love story. And we don't read about that. We just know that that is the real story. This is just an accident. It's like the whole story that Dostoevsky is giving us in The White Nights is a series of footnotes in a book, to a story that we are not reading, we don't have access to. So we constantly have this in our mind that, yeah, this is that margin. We are reading about an accident that happened as a kind of detour away from the main line of the story. But that main line of the story is somewhere else. But we are referring to it. Okay. Now, there are differences, of course, but the main difference, some of the differences is that some of these features that I just talked about, some of them are more accentuated and less accentuated in either modernism or postmodernism. For example, irony is stronger in postmodernism. But the main difference is this character of austerity. Modernism is austere, and it embodies a kind of austerity and minimalism and willful poverty, or being willfully impoverished in its technique, because it wants to be aware of the elements, the process, elements of expression, and the project of expression. Because it wants to be aware, it retains its minimalistic character, because the more you add, the less you can be in control of everything that is going on, or even aware of everything that is going on. So it gets rid of ornamentation, decoration, and all the grandness that is associated with a lot of decoration. It is skeptical of decorativeness, ornaments, and excess. It sees them as excess. Postmodernism, by contrast, engages with decoration, but ironically. So you might have a classic or a classic painting, or a reference to a classic painting in a postmodernist movie, or within a postmodernist, collage. There's an element of something that is fully ornamented or highly ornamented. Another difference is their attitude towards fragmentation. In modernism, we have this sadness about the fragmented nature of the world, fragmented character of the world, the loss of the center, loss of the central narratives, grand narratives. But postmodernism celebrates that, and there's a joy and delight in that absence of a grand narrative and the presence of fragmentation. I wanted to also talk about another recent novel, Lapvona by Otessa Moshfegh. I would argue, and you should feel free to disagree if you're interested in reading the book, that this is a postmodernist novel. It's a very interesting novel. I have a review of it on the channel already. But what comes to my mind right now with reference to our discussion is that every character in Lapvona is associated with a metaphysic, with a worldview. So it is not the absence of worldviews or a very minimalist worldview that we might find in a modernist novel. We have multiple rich worldviews, metaphysical. There's a old female character that has this God as nature worldview, or nature as God, nature as a deity. But there are other forms of religiosity associated with other characters. So each character comes with a baggage of a worldview, and you put them together as you're reading the book. The result is that there's an undecidability with regard to what the worldview is attached to the book, to the story as a whole. There is no one single worldview. There is no one single metaphysical stance. These worldviews exist together instead of having one worldview. Something that Peter Barry discusses towards the end of this chapter, chapter 4, is the theme of waiting as important in modernism and postmodernism, especially postmodernism. Why is the theme of why waiting as a subject matter, as a topic, becomes important, especially important in postmodernism or modernism? Waiting for Godot, modernist work of theater, play, but also plays of Harold Pinter, The Birthday Party, The Room, The Dumb Waiter. These are examples of Harold Pinter's plays where waiting is important. So why waiting is important? Because with waiting, you're showing the effect of something that is absent. Waiting for Godot. Godot is absent, but despite the absence, there's the effect. There are consequences or influences of the thing that is absent. You're showing the effect of something that is absent, and yet it is still exerting influence. Another more, very well known is that short story Kafka says within the novel The Trial, that beautiful, unforgettable short story of the man who is waiting at the court of law, waiting for his turn to get a response from the justice system or the law. But he has to wait indefinitely. Occasionally, the characters forget in these kinds of scenarios. It is possible for the characters to forget. In Waiting for Godot, it happens clearly. They forget that they're waiting. And once they forget, they start to express themselves in new, interesting ways. They start to play, for example, they play with language. They play language games. They start joking around. Why? Just to pass time. These moments are moments of liberation from the thing that they're waiting for. Small moments of liberation from the grand narrative that they're longing for. It's showing as if these writers are showing us that without such grand narratives, if we really truly forget them, if we truly stop hoping that they will arrive, that they'll come and save us, what can happen is that we can be playful, we can express ourselves as these characters express themselves in small scale games that happen in a very small scale, in a very small way, very compatible and consistent with our own mortal existence. One book that is mentioned by Peter Berry in this, relevant to this, that caught my eye, I'm very interested in it now, is a book by the famous Lyotard, Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote The Postmodern Condition. He has another book called Just Gaming. And speaking of games, Nietzsche, it becomes more clear after reading this chapter, even though there's no reference to Nietzsche. But the reference to games, reference to play, makes it clear why Nietzsche is a major figure for postmodernism. Because creating your games, playing with rules, coming up with your own rules, is something that we can do in the absence of grand narratives, in the absence of unifying God. Okay, let me know what you think, if you have any feedback, any thoughts, any questions, and looking forward to speaking with you soon. Bye for now.